There was a very interesting post this morning on mirrorless rumors that showed what appears to be a new mirrorless camera from Nikon called the Z1. Now, this wasn't just some rendering where somebody's taken like the Z6 or Z7 body and just photoshopped the 6 into a 1. You can clearly see it's a picture of a physical camera body, and the body design is quite a bit different to the Z6 and Z7, so it's not like somebody's just rebadged one. So clearly this is a physical camera body that Nikon are working on, and it's presumably going to try and be a direct competitor to the Canon RP. And would make perfect sense that Nikon tries and goes for that part of the market, because that's how you would draw people into the system. You know, those lower end cameras are going to sell in far greater numbers than higher end cameras will, and people are more likely to work their way up a system than jump straight in at the top of it. So looking at this image of the Z1, there appears to be a few key differences in body design between the Z1 to the Z6. If you look at the Z6, you've got the main mode dial on the left of the viewfinder, you've got a small LCD on the right of the viewfinder, and then obviously the rest of the grip after that. With the Z1, however, the mode dial appears to be on the right side of the viewfinder. There's no top LCD screen there, so the body itself looks like it's slightly smaller. It looks more like the size of one of the Sony A7 cameras. Also, comparing up body sizes, you can see from the Z6, looking at pictures of it, there's quite a bit of overhang of the body front and back of the mode dial, giving you an idea as to how deep the body actually is. With the Z1, however, the body appears to be narrower. Now, one of the most interesting things I noticed about that Z1 image is above the lens mount, because whereas on the Z6 you've got a very short gap between the front of the viewfinder and then it steps down gradually into the lens mount, with the Z1 it appears to be a much more flushed top to the body, dropping straight into the lens mount, and then there appears to be a small screen on top of the body in front of the viewfinder. Now, I'm speculating, judging off the picture, that it's a screen. It looks like it's a screen. And if that's the case, the only thing that I can think that it might be is going to be a focus distance scale, which I think is a very clever idea. Because in most conventional DSLR lenses, particularly the higher end lenses, you would have a little focus window where you could see your distance scale on the lens. However, most mirrorless lenses that are using a fly-by-wire focus system don't actually have a focus distance scale on the lens. I know on the Sony, for example, you do get a kind of a focus distance scale in the viewfinder. When you manually focus, it will come up with a little focus distance bar at the bottom. Now, usually with the DSLR lenses, that focus distance scale would actually be a physical focus distance scale that you would see moving under a glass window. However, in newer lenses, such as the likes of the Canon 70-300 IS USM Mark II, it actually replaces that plastic screen with a little LED screen. So it lets you change between focus distance, your focal length, and also a spirit level, so you can see if your camera's tilted at all. So maybe Nikon are going to employ a screen like that onto the camera body itself, which means every single lens that you then use, you would have a focus distance scale for, which I think would be a neat little trick. The other thing that confuses me slightly about this picture of the Z6 is the lens mount itself. Obviously, it's a Z mount, it's a Z camera, so that's not what bothers me. But the size of the opening within the lens mount looks a bit strange, because there appears to be a smaller inner circle within the lens mount that wouldn't physically be big enough to fit a full frame sensor behind. It looks more like it's trying to channel the light into an APS-C size sensor. I mean, it does state clearly on the top of the body FX, which is obviously full frame, but there's no way that that lens mount with that size of a gap is big enough for a full frame sensor. When you look at a frontal shot of the Z6, the corners of the sensor pretty much get to the edges of the lens mount. So if that indentation was on the body, it would cover up the corners of the sensor and you would get extreme vignetting in your photos. So maybe that is just something to do with the prototype, that it's maybe not got a sensor in there, and with it being just a mock-up body shell, they've added that inner circle for some reason that I can't fathom. But maybe that's also a prototype testing out a potential APS-C camera for a Z mount that Nikon are working on. Now, is this camera going to be released? Who knows? It would make perfect sense that they release this camera, because it would be, you know, just another step to drawing people into the Z mount system. Nikon are clearly working on it, because you can see a prototype of it right here. It's not some, you know, computer generated rendering. That is a physical camera body that Nikon have made. It's just whether they can come up with a finished result that they feel is worth releasing. In terms of features and specs for the Z1, if it does come out, nobody really knows at the minute. I imagine it will be a watered down version of the Z6. So it would probably be the Z6 with, you know, slower shooting speed, reduced video features, probably not an XQD slot. It would probably go back to an SD card slot. All in all, it would probably make for a very good introduction for people thinking of moving onto the Z series of cameras. And obviously Nikon have already got the Z6 as a mid-range camera and the Z7 as a higher end camera all ready to go as well, for people who then want to start moving up the system. Now, the other point that this rumor then sparked is, are Sony going to react to it? So obviously, if this Z1 is coming out, it's in response to Canon releasing a very low budget RP full frame mirrorless body. So are Sony going to bring out something like an A5 as an even cheaper version of the A7? And again, that would make sense that, you know, if everybody's bringing out cheaper cameras, that Sony react to it and bring out a cheap one as well. However, if they do, I don't know what they would actually do with it. Canon and Nikon are both on their first generation of full-frame mirrorless cameras, so there is no cheaper alternative for their shooters at the moment. Sony, however, are on their third generation. So, you know, if the A7 III is too much camera for you or is too expensive for you, there's already cheaper options on the market, the likes of the A7 II, which are currently, you can get secondhand now for below £1,000. And the A7 III is essentially a jacked up version of the A7 II. So if they watered down the A7 III and made an A5, is that essentially going to end up being like the A7 II? I mean, the differences between the A7 II to the A7 III are a BSI sensor in the A7 III that's not in the Mark II. Both of them have IBIS. The A7 III shoots at 10 frames a second versus 5 of the A7 II. The battery life on the A7 III is better, the autofocus system's better, the video features are better, it's got dual memory card slots as well. There's a few differences between the 3 and the 2. So if they were to do a new A5 lineup, then I imagine that the specs would probably be somewhere between the second and third generation. So probably the same BSI sensor as in the A7 III, but the shooting speed is probably going to be brought down to more like 5 frames a second. The autofocus, I don't know. I imagine it'll probably have the older AF system from the likes of the A7 II, but maybe just with some improvements. Things like the eye autofocus might be left out of it. Maybe in-body stabilization might be scrapped from it, the same way they did with the A6400. Probably only one SD card slot. And then I imagine it's probably going to have reduced processing power, so it wouldn't have the same video features either, so maybe wouldn't have 120 FPS in full HD. Dare say it wouldn't have 4K, but I imagine the 4K wouldn't be 6K downsampled like the A7 III. I imagine they'll go more with pixel binning straight in camera. Who knows? But I definitely think 2019 and 2020 is going to be the time where we see a lot of cheaper, more budget-friendly full-frame mirrorless options, and even high-end APS-C mirrorless options perhaps starting to come out and drawing people away from DSLRs. But what do you guys think? Do you think this Z1 is a likely option? What do you think it's going to be like? Do you think Sony are going to follow suit as well? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.